Caroline Norton's fingers trembled against her son's burning forehead as his chest rose one final time. 2 years. She'd been legally barred from seeing him for 2 years, and now, in this cramped servants' room where sympathetic staff had hidden them both, 9-year-old William was dying in the arms of a mother he no longer recognized. The message had reached her that morning. Her youngest was gravely ill. She'd rushed from her brother's house, her heart pounding with each turn of the carriage wheels. But the law that had stolen her children also controlled when she could see them, even as they lay dying. George Norton, her estranged husband, had finally permitted this visit only when the doctor confirmed it was too late. "Mama?" William's voice came out as barely a whisper. His eyes, glazed with fever, searched her face without recognition. She'd missed 2 years of bedtime stories, of soothing his nightmares, of teaching him his letters. The law had declared that her children belonged to their father as absolutely as his watch or his boots. She held him tighter, feeling his small body grow still. No final words of love, no last moment of clarity, just the quiet extinguishing of a life she'd created but couldn't legally claim. Outside, church bells marked the hour. Inside, a mother discovered that British law had found the cruelest possible way to erase a woman's existence, by letting her live just long enough to watch everything she loved slip away. But how did British law transform marriage into legal murder? And why did saying "I do" mean saying goodbye to your very existence? To find the answer, we have to rewind to when brides walked down aisles, not knowing they were walking into carefully designed traps that would destroy brilliant minds, steal children, and mutilate bodies. The wedding night was just the beginning of the horror. The pen fell from her fingers at exactly 10:47 a.m. Not because she dropped it, because legally, the hand holding it no longer existed. Just yesterday, Miss Eleanor Pemberton had signed a contract to purchase property in London. Her signature carried weight, bound agreements, moved money. But this morning, as Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, that same signature meant nothing. The church bells that celebrated her wedding also tolled for the death of her legal personhood. Here's the thing about Victorian marriage law. It didn't just change a woman's rights. It erased her existence entirely. Sir William Blackstone, whose legal commentaries shaped British law for generations, put it this way: by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Suspended, like she'd been hung up in a closet until her husband decided to take her down again. Except he never would. Because why would you resurrect someone whose non-existence gave you absolute power? But it gets worse. This wasn't some archaic technicality gathering dust in law libraries. This was coverture, the doctrine that covered a married woman's legal identity with her husband's, like throwing a sheet over furniture in an abandoned house. And it affected every married woman in Britain, from factory workers to duchesses. The numbers are staggering. By 1851, over 3 million married women in England and Wales had vanished into legal non-existence. They couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't even claim the clothes on their backs. The moment they said, "I do," everything they owned, money, property, even future inheritance, instantly transferred to their husbands. Think about that. A woman could inherit a fortune on Tuesday, marry on Wednesday, and be penniless by Thursday, not because she'd spent it or lost it, but because the law declared that she no longer existed to own it. Francis Powercobe, who watched this happen to friend after friend, wrote, "A woman's legal death by marriage is so complete that she cannot even claim her own earnings. A charwoman who works 16 hours scrubbing floors, her wages belong entirely to her husband. He can collect them from her employer and drink them away at the public house while she and her children starve." Now remember, this wasn't about protection or providing for women. A husband had no legal obligation to share a penny of his wife's former property with her. He could sell her inheritance, pocket her wages, dispose of her belongings, and leave her with nothing. The legal term was unity of person, but unity implies two things joining together. This was absorption, one person swallowing another whole, and the courts upheld it with religious fervour. In 1865, when Mrs. Elizabeth Anderson tried to register to vote using her property qualifications, the registrar laughed. "But madam," he explained, as if to a child, "you don't exist." She pointed out that she paid taxes on that property. "Your husband pays taxes," he corrected. "The property is his, you are. Nothing. Nothing." That was the word that echoed through courtrooms and government offices whenever a married woman tried to assert any rights. You are nothing. You own nothing. You are entitled to nothing. In the eyes of the law, you are already dead. But the real horror wasn't what she lost. It was what he gained. A husband didn't just get property rights. He got possession of a human being as completely as if he'd purchased her at auction, and the law backed him up every step of the way. Women who'd run businesses found themselves locked out of their own shops. Writers discovered their manuscripts now belonged to their husbands to publish or burn as they pleased. Artists watched their paintings sold without their consent, the money vanishing into their husbands' pockets. Caroline Norton would later write about watching her own books, novels she'd written, poetry she'd crafted, sold by her estranged husband while she couldn't afford food. "I exist for the law only as his property," she said. "I am his chattel, to be used or discarded as he sees fit." And this was just the beginning of her erasure, because if losing your legal existence was terrifying, wait until you hear what happened when children entered the picture. The nursery door splintered under the bailiff's shoulder. Inside, 3 children screamed as strangers dragged them from their beds. Caroline Norton reached the doorway just in time to see her youngest son William's terrified face disappear around the corner. "Mama!" The single word echoed down the empty hallway. It would be 2 years before she'd hear his voice again, and by then, it would be too late. This wasn't a kidnapping in any criminal sense. This was the law working exactly as designed. George Norton had decided to punish his wife for daring to leave him after years of violence. His weapon? The Custody of Infants Act, which gave fathers absolute ownership of their children. Here's the thing about Victorian custody law. Yet mothers had no rights whatsoever. None. A father could take a nursing infant from its mother's breast and give it to his mistress to raise. He could forbid all contact between mother and children. He could even deny a dying child the comfort of its mother's presence. All perfectly legal. Caroline's crime? She'd fled to her brother's house after George had beaten her unconscious. She'd dared to seek safety from a man who'd already broken her ribs twice. For this rebellion, she would pay with her children. The letters she wrote during those 2 years of separation survive. They read like messages from a prisoner of war. "I beg you, let me see them just once. Let me know they are well. William had a cough when you took them. Has it improved? Does Fletcher still say his prayers? Has Brinsley learned to read?" Silence. George Norton didn't even acknowledge her letters. Under the law, he didn't have to. The children were his property, as absolutely as his furniture or his horses. A mother's love, a child's need, these were sentimental concerns the law didn't recognize. But it gets worse. Caroline wasn't alone. Across Britain, thousands of mothers lived this nightmare. Mrs. Elizabeth Ashton hadn't seen her daughters in 5 years after leaving her alcoholic husband. Lady Rosina Bulwer, Lytton's children were raised to believe their mother was dead while she lived just miles away. The legal precedents were chilling. In Rex versus Greenhill, 1836, a father successfully sued his wife's family for harboring his children, even though he'd abandoned them, and his wife was supporting them entirely. The judge ruled, the father's right is absolute and unchallengeable. Now remember, these weren't deadbeat fathers fighting for custody out of love. Most wanted their children as bargaining chips. George Norton made his intentions clear in a letter to Caroline's brother. "She may see the children when she returns to her proper place as my wife and submits to my authority, not before." The message was unmistakable. Submit or lose your children forever. It was a form of legal torture designed to break rebellious wives, and it worked. Countless women returned to violent husbands rather than lose their children entirely. But some tragedies couldn't be undone by submission. In 1842, little William Norton fell ill with lockjaw. For days, he suffered while Caroline begged George to let her see him. Her letters grew increasingly desperate. "He is dying. You know he is dying. Let me hold him. Let me say goodbye." George finally relented. but only after the doctor confirmed William had hours to live. Caroline rushed to the house, but by the time she was admitted to that back servant's room, her son barely knew her. 2 years of forced separation had stolen not just time, but recognition itself. She wouldn't know for 2 years if he was even alive. During those years, she'd started a legal campaign to change custody laws. She'd written pamphlets, lobbied Parliament, gathered testimonies from other bereaved mothers, but change came too slowly to save her own children. The judge who'd upheld George's custody rights later commented on the case. His response would haunt her forever. The law cannot bend to accommodate female sentiment. Order must be maintained. Order. That's what they called children crying for their mothers in the night. Order. That's what they labelled a dying child, forbidden his mother's comfort. The law had found a way to make maternal love itself illegal, but taking her children was just practice. Next, they'd take something that should have been impossible to steal. Frances Power Cobbe watched her father's coffin lower into the ground, unaware she was burying her future with him. The will reading took place in her father's study, surrounded by the books he'd encouraged her to read, the desk where he'd taught her to write. £20,000, a fortune that would secure her independence forever. Her father had spent years building this legacy for his brilliant daughter. But Frances had made one mistake. She'd married John Lambert 2 years earlier, and under the law of coverture, that inheritance might as well have been dropped into the ocean. Here's the thing about Victorian property law, DHE. It didn't just apply to what women owned when they married. It was retroactive and absolute. Any money, property, or inheritance that came to a married woman automatically belonged to her husband forever. The morning after the will reading, Frances discovered what this meant. John had already visited her father's banker. The accounts had been transferred. Her inheritance, every penny her father had saved through decades of careful management, now sat in her husband's sole control. "But surely," she protested to the family lawyer, "my father intended that money for me." The lawyer's sympathetic look said everything. "The law is clear, Mrs. Lambert. A married woman cannot own property. Your husband is being very generous to allow you pin money." Pin money. A few pounds here and there for ribbons and gloves, doled out like treats to a child. This from a fortune that could have bought a house, funded a career, secured a lifetime of independence. But it gets worse. John Lambert wasn't even a cruel husband by Victorian standards. He simply saw Frances's inheritance as rightfully his nightfall, a windfall to invest in his failing business ventures. When she begged him to set aside something for their future, he patted her hand. "Don't worry your head about business, my dear. That's my domain." Within 18 months, the entire inheritance was gone. Bad investments, risky ventures, debts she knew nothing about until the bailiffs arrived. £20,000 vanished like morning mist, and Frances had no legal recourse whatsoever. She later wrote, "To marry is, for a woman, to throw her property into the sea, with the blind trust that her husband will dive down and bring it back to her when needed. But what if he swims away instead?" Now remember, this wasn't unusual. It was standard practice. Across Britain, women watched their inheritances vanish into their husband's control. Mrs. Sarah Richardson inherited 3 houses from her aunt. Her husband sold them all to cover gambling debts. Miss Mary Ashford received a legacy of railway shares from her godmother. Her husband liquidated them within a month of their wedding. The legal mechanisms were breathtakingly efficient. A husband didn't need his wife's signature or even her knowledge to dispose of her property. Banks transferred accounts automatically upon proof of marriage. Property deeds were rewritten without consultation. Investment dividends redirected without notice. The newspapers occasionally reported the most egregious cases. In Birmingham, a woman who'd inherited a profitable millinery shop arrived one morning to find her husband had sold it overnight. In Manchester, a wife discovered her childhood home had been mortgaged when creditors came to evict her. But the real cruelty lay in the smaller thefts. Wedding gifts from family, legally his. Jewellery passed down through generations, his to pawn. Even the clothes women brought to marriage became their husband's property. One court case involved a husband who sold his wife's entire wardrobe, leaving her with nothing but the dress she wore. The judges upheld these rights without question. Lord Justice Fletcher, ruling on a case where a husband had sold his wife's inherited library, declared, "The law cannot concern itself with domestic arrangements. What a husband does with his property is his business alone. His property, not their property, never her property." The pronouns revealed everything about how the law viewed married women as legal non-entities whose possessions, like their persons, simply cease to exist. Some women tried to circumvent the law through trusts and settlements, but these required expensive lawyers and cooperative male relatives. Most women had neither. They watched their economic futures disappear into their husbands' hands, powerless to prevent it. By sunset, 20 years of her father's savings had vanished. Frances would spend the rest of her life dependent on her husband's financial decisions, watching him squander what her father had spent decades building. If they could steal inherited money, imagine what happened to money women earned themselves. Ellen Woodhouse's fingers bled from 16-hour days stitching silk. Her husband's fingers bled from counting her profits at the gambling table. For 5 years, Ellen had built her dressmaking business stitch by careful stitch. Starting with a single sewing machine in their front parlour, she now employed 20 seamstresses and counted half of London's wealthy ladies among her clients. Her shop on Bond Street displayed gowns that rivaled anything from Paris. But here's the thing about Victorian business law, 2HE. A married woman couldn't legally own a business. Every contract Ellen signed was void. Every payment she collected belonged to her husband. Every decision she made could be overruled by the man who'd never threaded a needle in his life. Thomas Woodhouse had discovered the perfect scheme. While Ellen worked 18-hour days during the season, managing orders and training apprentices, he collected her earnings directly from clients. The account books showed deposits of hundreds of pounds weekly, money that never reached Ellen's hands. "I need fabric for the Countess's order," Ellen would plead. "The girls need their wages." "Business is slow this month," Thomas would lie, his breath sharp with gin. "Make do with what you have." Business wasn't slow. Ellen's appointment book overflowed with orders, but Thomas's gambling debts overflowed faster. Every pound Ellen earned vanished into the bottomless pit of his addiction, while she struggled to maintain the business's reputation with increasingly threadbare resources. But it gets worse. When suppliers came calling for payment, they didn't want excuses. The law said Thomas Woodhouse owned the business, so Thomas Woodhouse was responsible for its debts. Except Thomas had no intention of paying anyone. Ellen watched helplessly as bailiffs inventoried her shop. 20 sewing machines, seized. Bolts of silk and satin, confiscated. Even the half-finished gowns for clients, claimed by creditors. 5 years of building her empire, and it crumbled in a single morning. She'd built an empire. He'd found a gold mine, and the law ensured the gold flowed only one direction. Now remember, Ellen's story wasn't unique. Across Britain, women's businesses funded their husbands' failures. Mrs. Catherine Morris ran a thriving bakery that employed 8 people, until her husband decided to invest the profits in a doomed mining venture. Mrs. Agnes Fletcher's successful boarding house kept her family comfortable for years, until her husband remortgaged it for a fraction of its value. The pattern was always the same. Women did the work, men claimed the profits, and when businesses failed due to husbands' mismanagement, guess who bore the consequences? The bankruptcy papers had only one name on them. Guess whose? But the shame, the destroyed reputation, the lost livelihood, those belonged entirely to Ellen. Her seamstresses, thrown out of work, blamed her for their lost wages. Her clients, their orders unfulfilled, spread word that Mrs. Woodhouse couldn't be trusted. Thomas, meanwhile, faced no consequences. The law recognized him as the business owner, but when the business failed, he simply shrugged. Women's work, he told his drinking companions, too emotional for commerce. The irony burned. Ellen had managed inventory, negotiated with suppliers, innovated designs, and built a clientele through sheer talent and determination. Thomas had managed only to destroy it all, yet the law proclaimed him the natural head of business affairs. Some women tried to protect their businesses through subterfuge. They operated under male relatives' names, funneled profits through trusted friends, or dealt entirely in cash they could hide. But these strategies carried risks. One discovered cache of hidden earnings gave husbands grounds to beat their wives for deception. The economic impact was staggering. Parliamentary reports from the 1850s estimated that married women's unpaid or stolen wages amounted to millions of pounds annually. Money that could have lifted families from poverty instead disappeared into public houses and gambling dens. Ellen Woodhouse ended up taking in piecework sewing, the same work she'd done before building her business. But now she competed with her former employees for pennies per garment. Her husband still collected her meager earnings, still drank them away, still complained that she didn't earn enough. She wrote to her sister, "I am Sisyphus in petticoats, forever pushing the boulder of his debts uphill, only to watch it roll down again. But unlike Sisyphus, I once stood at the summit. I know what I have lost." The summit, her shop, her independence, her life's work, remained forever out of reach. The law had made sure of that. But financial ruin was gentle compared to what the law explicitly allowed husbands to do next. The judge held up his thumb. "No thicker than this," he said, as if measuring ingredients for a recipe rather than implements for beating women. Lord Justice Buller's 1782 ruling had become gospel in Victorian courtrooms. A husband could legally beat his wife with any rod no thicker than his thumb. The rule of thumb, they called it, transforming domestic violence into a matter of proper measurement rather than criminal assault. Hannah Mullins sat in the witness box, her left arm in a sling, her face still purple from bruising. She'd finally gathered the courage to press charges against her husband after 5 years of escalating violence. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Broken ribs, a fractured skull, neighbours' testimonies of screams in the night. But here's the thing about Victorian domestic violence law, worldwide. It wasn't designed to protect women. It was designed to regulate how much violence was acceptable, and the threshold for too much was virtually unreachable. The prosecutor presented the medical evidence: 3 broken ribs, a concussion severe enough to cause temporary blindness, bite marks on her shoulders, burns on her arms from a heated poker. The courtroom grew silent as each injury was catalogued. Then the defense attorney stood. "My client admits to correcting his wife's behavior, but examine the rod he used, clearly within legal limits. As for the other injuries, who can say how a clumsy woman might hurt herself about the house?" Clumsy. Hannah had worked as a seamstress before marriage, her fingers so steady she could thread a needle in candlelight. But now her clumsiness had somehow resulted in injuries consistent with systematic torture. The hospital report listed injuries that should have meant attempted murder charges. Dr. Matthews, who treated Hannah, testified, "In 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen such severe injuries in a living patient. Another blow to her head would likely have been fatal. But it gets worse." The judge seemed more concerned with Hannah's behavior than her injuries. What had she done to provoke such correction? Had she been obedient, respectful? Had she fulfilled her wifely duties? Hannah's voice shook as she answered. She'd burned dinner once, spoken sharply when he came home drunk, failed to have his clothes ready one morning when he'd given no notice of needing them. Each transgression was weighed against her injuries, as if measuring whether her bruises were proportionate to her crimes. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty of assault, but with extreme provocation. The sentence? 14 days in jail and a £5 fine. For nearly killing his wife, Robert Mullins would serve less time than a pickpocket. Instead, the judge had different advice for Hannah. "Perhaps, Mrs. Mullins, you might reflect during your husband's brief absence on how to better maintain domestic harmony. A wise wife knows how to soothe her husband's temper rather than inflame it." Now remember, Hannah's case was exceptional only because it reached court at all. Most domestic violence never left the home. Women knew that pressing charges meant public humiliation, victim blaming, and minimal consequences for their attackers. The statistics, when anyone bothered to collect them, were horrifying. Hospital records from London showed that 1 in 4 women admitted for injuries had been beaten by their husbands, but police reports showed fewer than 1 in 100 faced any charges. The law actively protected violent husbands. A woman who fled her abusive home could be forcibly returned. The police would drag her back to her husband like a runaway slave. If she took her children, she'd be charged with kidnapping. If she fought back, She faced assault charges far more severe than any her husband might receive. Legal precedent after legal precedent reinforced men's right to correct their wives. In Queen v. Jackson, 1891, a husband who'd imprisoned his wife in their home was initially supported by the courts. Only public outcry forced a reversal, and even then, the judge lamented the weakening of marital authority. Frances Power Cobbe documented hundreds of cases in her pamphlet Wife Torture in England. Women blinded by acid attacks. Women whose bones had been broken systematically over years. Women burned with hot irons, branded like cattle. In almost every case, the husbands received minimal sentences or none at all. The rule of thumb eventually fell out of explicit use, but the principle remained. Violence within marriage was a private matter unless it went too far, and too far, apparently, meant death. Anything short of murder was merely excessive discipline. Hannah Mullins returned to her husband after his 2-week sentence. What choice did she have? She couldn't leave, couldn't work, couldn't protect herself. 6 months later, she was dead. The coroner ruled it accidental. Her neighbours knew better, but the law had already spoken. If the courts sanctioned violence, wait until you hear what the doctors prescribed. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown's surgical tools clinked against the metal tray. His next patient didn't know she'd wake up anatomically destroyed. The young woman on his operating table had been brought in by her husband with a list of alarming symptoms. She read too many books, showed insufficient interest in household duties, and worst of all, had expressed opinions about politics. Dr. Brown had seen this constellation of symptoms before. His diagnosis was swift. Hysteria caused by excessive stimulation. His cure was even swifter. Here's the thing about Victorian medical practice. Doctors didn't just treat women's bodies. They enforced social compliance through surgery. And Dr. Isaac Baker Brown had perfected the ultimate enforcement tool, clitoridectomy, the surgical removal of the clitoris to cure unruly women. Between 1859 and 1866, Dr. Brown performed thousands of these procedures at his London surgical home. His patients included women whose symptoms ranged from reading novels to refusing marriage proposals. The common thread? They'd all violated Victorian expectations of feminine behaviour. Mrs. Elizabeth Ashford had been brought to Dr. Brown by her husband after she'd started attending suffrage meetings. She's become excitable, her husband explained. Argumentative. She neglects her duties. Dr. Brown nodded knowingly. He'd seen this pattern of female rebellion before, and he knew exactly how to cure it. The surgery took less than an hour. No consent was required. Husbands could authorize any medical procedure for their wives. Elizabeth woke up mutilated, her body forever altered without her knowledge or permission. The symptoms, Dr. Brown claimed to cure had one thing in common. They all involved women thinking or acting independently. But it gets worse. Dr. Brown published his results proudly in medical journals, boasting of his success rate. Women who'd been difficult became docile. Women who'd shown interest in education lost all intellectual curiosity. Women who'd resisted their husbands' demands became compliant. He saw this destruction of personality as proof his treatment worked. His medical notes reveal the true horror. Patient after patient admitted for the crime of independence, discharged as shadows of their former selves. Mrs. R., aged 23, brought by husband for excessive novel reading and neglect of needlework. Treatment successful. 5. Patient now shows appropriate domestic focus. What he didn't note, Mrs. R. had been writing her own novel. She never wrote another word. When she woke up, something fundamental was missing, not just physically, but psychologically. Women reported feeling disconnected from their own bodies, unable to experience joy or pleasure in any form. The surgery didn't just remove tissue, it severed women's connection to their own humanity. Now remember, Dr. Brown wasn't some rogue practitioner. He was president of the Medical Society of London, a respected surgeon who trained others in his techniques. His London surgical home was considered a premier institution for treating difficult women. The medical establishment largely supported him. The Lancet published favourable reviews of his work. Other doctors referred patients to him. It was only when he began operating on women from wealthy, influential families that questions arose, not about the ethics of mutilating women, but about whether he was choosing appropriate patients. In 1867, Dr. Brown was finally expelled from the Obstetrical Society, AI, not for the thousands of women he'd mutilated, but for operating on a woman whose brother was a powerful politician. The vote was narrow, 194 for expulsion, 38 against. A third of his colleagues saw nothing wrong with his practices. But the damage was done. Thousands of women across Britain lived with the consequences of his surgeries. Many never knew exactly what had been done to them. Their husbands and doctors conspired to keep them ignorant. They only knew they'd been fundamentally changed, their bodies altered to enforce their submission. Other forms of medical control were equally horrific. Doctors prescribed month-long courses of pelvic massage to break women's will. They cauterized cervixes to calm female excitement. They removed ovaries to cure everything from epilepsy to disagreeing with their husbands. The medical justifications always centered on women's supposed mental weakness. Strong emotions, intellectual activity, or physical exercise could apparently tip women into hysteria. The cure was always the same: remove or destroy whatever part of women's bodies gave them autonomy or pleasure. Dr. Brown continued practicing privately after his expulsion, protected by grateful husbands who appreciated his work. He died peacefully in 1873, never facing justice for his crimes. His victims lived on, mutilated and silenced, reminders that Victorian medicine saw female independence as a disease to be cured by any means necessary. Physical mutilation was horrific, but the asylum system offered something worse: burial alive. Rosina Bulwer, Lytton's crime? She'd written that her husband's novels were tedious. Her sentence? Indefinite confinement with the insane. The morning of June 23rd, 1858, started like any other for Lady Rosina. She was preparing for a trip to London when 3 men appeared at her door: a doctor she'd never met, a lawyer she didn't know, and a magistrate who refused to explain his presence. Within an hour, she was in a carriage bound for Wyke House, a private asylum for difficult women. Here's the thing about Victorian asylum law, DA. Committing a wife required only 2 signatures from doctors who didn't even need to examine her. A husband's word that his wife was excitable or unmanageable was sufficient for a diagnosis of insanity. And once inside an asylum, women had no legal recourse for release. Edward Bulwer Lytton, celebrated novelist and politician, had found the perfect solution to his marital problems. Divorce would create scandal. Murder was too risky. But having his wife declared insane, that was perfectly legal and socially acceptable. Rosina's real crimes were unforgivable by Victorian standards. She'd publicly criticized her husband's writing. Worse, she'd written her own novels exposing his cruelty. When he'd cut off her allowance, she dared to petition Parliament for support. Such behaviour clearly indicated a diseased mind, at least according to the doctors Edward paid. The asylum director hadn't even examined her. He didn't need to. The commitment papers were in order, the fees were paid, and Mrs. Bulwer Lytton was now his patient, regardless of her actual mental state. Her protests only confirmed her diagnosis. What sane woman would claim her celebrated husband was persecuting her? But it gets worse. Inside Wyke House, Rosina discovered dozens of other inconvenient wives. Mrs. Catherine Weldon, committed for refusing to sign over her inheritance. Mrs. Mary Ashton, declared insane after catching her husband with his mistress. Mrs. Eleanor Bright, whose crime was asking for a separation after years of beatings. None of these women were insane by any medical definition. They were simply obstacles to their husbands' desires, removed as efficiently as unwanted furniture. The asylum system had become a private prison network for disobedient wives. Multiple physicians declared her sane after examining her, but their opinions carried no legal weight. Only the doctors who'd committed her, paid by her husband, could authorize her release. It was a perfect trap. The same financial incentive that put women in asylums kept them there indefinitely. Now remember, private madhouses operated as businesses. Each patient represented steady income from their families. Why release a profitable lunatic when her husband paid promptly for her continued confinement? Some women spent decades in asylums, their sanity intact but their freedom gone forever. The alleged Lunatics' Friends Society, formed in 1845, tried to investigate these abuses. Their files revealed hundreds of similar cases, women locked away for reading the wrong books, expressing political opinions, or simply annoying their husbands. But the society faced an uphill battle against a system designed to silence women. The conditions inside varied from genteel imprisonment to outright torture. White House was relatively comfortable. Rosina had her own room and could write letters, though they were censored. Other establishments used cold water treatments, restraints, and isolation to break women's spirits. The goal wasn't cure but control. Rosina's case became a scandal only because she had powerful friends. The writer Charles Reade launched a public campaign for her release. Newspapers picked up the story. Questions were asked in Parliament. After just 3 weeks, Edward was forced to release her, not because she was sane, but because the publicity threatened his political career. The Society's files revealed hundreds of similar cases. In Manchester, they found a woman who'd been confined for 10 years for excessive charity work. In Birmingham, a wife locked away for refusing to entertain her husband's mistress. Each file told the same story. Sane women buried alive in madhouses for the crime of inconveniencing men. But most women weren't so fortunate. Without influential friends or public attention, they remained trapped. Some gave up hope and genuinely went mad from confinement. Others learned to perform sanity as their captors defined it: silent, obedient, broken. The asylum system revealed the ultimate logic of Victorian marriage law. If wives were property, then malfunctioning property could be warehoused until it learned to behave. The threat alone kept many women in line. "Be careful," husbands would warn, "or you'll end up like poor Mrs. So-and-so in the madhouse." Those who escaped the asylum faced another kind of life sentence, one measured in pregnancies. Every working-class woman knew the odds. Spin the chamber 30 times, and 1 bullet finds you. Mary Thompson had already spun it 14 times. 14 pregnancies in 16 years of marriage, 10 living children, 4 small graves in the churchyard. Now, as she felt the familiar signs of a 15th pregnancy, she understood the mathematics of her own likely death. Here's the thing about Victorian childbirth. It wasn't just dangerous, it was deliberately made more dangerous by law. Women had no legal right to refuse their husband's sexual demands, no access to contraception, no choice but to play reproductive Russian roulette until their bodies gave out. For working-class women like Mary, the odds were brutal. 1 in 30 would die in childbirth or from complications shortly after. Each pregnancy was another pull of the trigger, another chance for hemorrhage, infection, or exhaustion to claim them. And they had to keep pulling that trigger as long as their husbands demanded it. Dr. William Farr, compiler of medical statistics, documented the carnage in his 1876 report. In the poorest districts of Manchester, maternal mortality reached 1 in 25. In the slums of East London, 1 in 20. These weren't statistics, they were death sentences, written in women's bodies. But it gets worse. The wealthy had escape routes the poor couldn't access. Rich women hired wet nurses, avoiding the exhaustion of breastfeeding. They could afford chloroform for pain relief, clean bedding to prevent infection, and most importantly, doctors who might actually wash their hands. Mary Thompson spun that chamber 14 times. The 15th killed her. She hemorrhaged after delivery, bleeding out while the local midwife tried desperately to save her. Her husband remarried within 3 months. He needed someone to care for the 10 children Mary left behind. Now remember, these deaths were preventable. Doctors knew about antiseptic techniques by the 1860s. They understood the dangers of too frequent pregnancies. But the law gave husbands absolute control over their wives' bodies, and most men saw large families as proof of virility, regardless of the cost in women's lives. The class divide in maternal mortality was stark. Upper-class women faced odds of 1 in 200, still dangerous, but survivable. They could space pregnancies, rest between births, hire help for other children. Their bodies weren't worn down by manual labor and malnutrition before facing childbirth's trials. Her husband remarried within 3 months. Not from callousness, necessarily, but from necessity. 10 children needed care, and the law assumed another woman would step into Mary's place. Her replacement would face the same Russian roulette, the same inevitable mathematics of death. Working-class women tried everything to avoid pregnancy. They drank pennyroyal tea, knowing it might poison them. They lifted heavy weights, hoping to miscarry. They sought out dangerous back-alley procedures that killed as often as they prevented birth. The law called these attempts criminal. Women called them survival. The testimonies collected by early social reformers reveal the desperation. "I've buried 3 sisters to childbirth," wrote one woman. "Now it's my turn." Another, "16 times I've been through it. I pray each time will be the last, one way or another." But even discussing family limitation was dangerous. The Obscene Publications Act of 1857 made distributing contraceptive information illegal. Annie Besant was prosecuted in 1877 simply for publishing a pamphlet about family planning. The message was clear. Women's bodies were for breeding, and the law would ensure they kept breeding until they died. Some doctors tried to help. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell quietly advised women on spacing pregnancies. Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson suggested medical reasons for sexual abstinence when she saw exhausted mothers near breaking. But they risked their licenses with such advice. The psychological toll matched the physical. Women lived in constant fear, not just of death, but of leaving their existing children orphaned. They watched friends and neighbors die in childbirth, knowing their turn might come with the next pregnancy. Some deliberately stayed away from their husbands, sleeping in children's rooms or claiming illness. But the law backed husbands who demanded their conjugal rights. A wife who refused could be divorced for desertion. She'd lose her children, her home, her entire world. So women submitted, spinning that chamber again and again until their luck ran out. By 1890, maternal mortality had become a national scandal. Reformers demanded change, pointing out that Britain was killing its mothers at rates that shocked even conservative politicians. But change came slowly, and for women like Mary Thompson, it came too late. Her 10 children grew up motherless. The older girls pressed into service, raising the younger ones. It was a pattern repeated in countless working-class homes, women dying in childbirth, girls sacrificing their futures to replace them, the cycle continuing until someone broke it or it broke them. But some pregnant women faced dangers that would make even death in childbirth seem merciful. The coal dust caked so thick on Sarah's pregnant belly that the mine inspector didn't realize she was 9 months along until she collapsed mid-haul. For 12 hours a day, Sarah Richards crawled through tunnels 3 feet high, dragging 100-pound loads of coal. The leather harness bit into her swollen breasts. The chain between her legs chafed against her thighs, and deep in her belly, the baby that would be born in darkness kicked against the weight of the coal cart. Here's the thing about Victorian labour law, is not. It protected horses better than pregnant women. Pit ponies had regulated work hours and mandatory rest periods. Pregnant women had neither. They worked until labour began, sometimes giving birth in the very tunnels where they hauled coal. The Parliamentary Commission of 1842 sent investigators into Britain's mines. What they found shocked even hardened politicians. Women and girls, some as young as 6, working in conditions that would have been illegal for animals. But it was the pregnant women who horrified them most. Sarah's story was typical. Married at 16 to a miner, pregnant by 17, she joined him underground because his wages alone couldn't feed a family. The mine owners paid women half what they paid men, but in the brutal economics of Victorian poverty, even those pennies meant survival. But it gets worse. The darkness underground wasn't just physical, it was legal. These women were invisible to every system meant to protect workers. They couldn't join unions. They couldn't testify about conditions. They couldn't even legally claim their own wages. Their husbands collected their pay directly from the mine offices. She'd given birth in that same tunnel twice before. The first time, she'd been alone when labour started. She'd delivered her son by touch in absolute darkness, biting through the umbilical cord herself before crawling back to the surface with the newborn tied to her chest. The baby lived 3 days. Now remember, these weren't exceptional circumstances. The 1842 report documented hundreds of pregnant women working underground across Britain. In some mines, they outnumbered the men. Their bodies bore the evidence: spines curved from crawling, skin permanently stained black, lungs scarred from coal dust. Betty Harris, age 37, testified to the commission, "I have a belt round my waist and a chain passing between my legs, and I go on my hands and feet. The road is very steep, and we have to hold by a rope. I have drawn till I have had the skin off me. The belt and chain is worse when we are in the family way. I am." The phrase haunted the commissioners, "when we are in the family way," as if pregnancy were just another working condition, like bad weather or a difficult seam of coal. These women spoke of carrying children in their wombs while carrying coal on their backs with the same matter-of-fact tone. The inspector's report called it regrettable but necessary. The mine owners argued that without women's labour, coal prices would rise. The economy depended on pregnant women crawling through darkness, their unborn children absorbing coal dust with every breath their mothers took. Some women tried to hide their pregnancies, binding their bellies flat to keep working longer. Others worked until the moment labour began, then delivered in the mine shafts, before returning to work days later. They had no choice, lose a day's wages, and their families didn't eat. The 1842 Mines Act finally banned women from working underground, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Without underground wages, mining families faced starvation. Women turned to surface work, sorting coal in all weather, breaking rocks with hammers, pushing loaded carts up steep inclines. Still pregnant, still labouring, just visible now. Sarah Richards gave birth to her third child 2 days after the inspector found her. The baby girl was born small and struggling to breathe, her lungs already damaged by months of coal dust. She lived 6 weeks. Sarah was back at work within days of the burial. Not underground anymore, but breaking coal at the pit head, her body still bleeding from childbirth. The darkness followed these women even into daylight. Coal dust in their lungs meant constant coughing. Damaged spines meant chronic pain. And always, the knowledge that their daughters would likely face the same fate. Omar marriage to miners, pregnancy after pregnancy, bodies broken by labour both reproductive and industrial. The Commission's report sparked public outrage, but change came slowly. For women like Sarah, survival meant choosing between different kinds of darkness, the literal darkness of the mines, or the economic darkness of poverty. Either way, they crawled through it pregnant, labouring in every sense of the word. For those who survived all this, freedom existed, if you could afford 5 years' wages. Margaret counted the coins again. £600. Only 4 years and £400 until she could escape her torturer legally. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 had finally made divorce legally possible for ordinary people. There was just one problem: ordinary people couldn't afford it. The total cost, including court fees, lawyers, and required procedures, ranged from £500 to £1,000. For a working woman earning £10 a year, it might as well have been $1 million. Here's the thing about Victorian divorce law in Ply-Slythe. It wasn't designed to free abused women. It was designed to look like it might, while keeping freedom perpetually out of reach. The law required women to prove not just adultery, but adultery plus desertion, bigamy, rape, sodomy, bestiality, or extreme cruelty. Men only needed to prove simple adultery. Margaret Henderson had evidence of all of it. Her husband's mistress lived openly in their house. He'd beaten her unconscious multiple times. He'd infected her with syphilis from his prostitutes. By any reasonable standard, she qualified for divorce. She just needed to save £500 first. For 3 years, she'd skimmed pennies from the household money, hidden coins in flour jars, taken in secret sewing work, hiding the payments in her shoes. Every penny saved meant something else sacrificed. Medicine, when the children were sick, coal in winter, sometimes food. But it gets worse. Her husband discovered the cash one December morning, £400, hidden in a tea tin behind loose bricks in the cellar. Her freedom fund, accumulated penny by painful penny over 3 years of deprivation. He pocketed it without a word. She'd saved for 3 years. Then he found her hidden money. Not just found it, he'd been searching for it. Margaret learned later that he'd suspected her plans and systematically hunted for her savings. The law that made her property his also made her escape fund his to steal. The pawn shop owner recognized her wedding ring. It was the 5th one this week. Desperate women flooded pawn shops with wedding rings, trying to raise divorce fees. But a gold band might bring a few pounds, hardly a dent in the hundreds needed for legal freedom. Now remember, even if women somehow raised the money, the court process itself was designed to humiliate them. Divorce cases were heard in open court, with newspaper reporters present. Every detail of abuse, every sexual humiliation, every private degradation became public entertainment. The divorce court records from 1858 to 1870 show the pattern clearly. Of 3,000 petitions filed, fewer than 300 came from women. Of those, only 127 succeeded. The rest failed on technicalities, insufficient evidence, or simply because judges didn't believe women's testimony against their husbands. Mrs. Anna Sewell saved for 7 years before attempting divorce. She had witnesses to her husband's adultery, medical evidence of his violence, proof of his infection of her with venereal disease. The judge dismissed her petition because she'd continued living in the same house with him. What choice did she have? Which implied condemnation of his behavior. Some women found other routes to freedom. Emigration societies helped women escape to the colonies. Charitable organizations occasionally paid divorce costs for the most desperate cases. But for every woman who escaped, hundreds remained trapped. The real cost wasn't just financial. Women who divorced lost everything: children, homes, social standing. They became pariahs, unmarriageable, often unemployable. Hotels could refuse them rooms. Respectable boarding houses turned them away. They'd traded one form of social death for another. Margaret never did save enough for divorce, but she found another way out. One night, after a particularly severe beating, she didn't get up. The coroner ruled it natural causes. A weak heart, he said. The neighbours knew better. She'd simply decided that death was cheaper than divorce. Her story repeated across Britain. Women choosing the river over continued marriage. Women taking poison rather than face another pregnancy. Women simply wasting away, refusing food and medicine until their bodies gave up. When death was the only affordable escape, some took it. The reformers collected these stories, building pressure for change. But change came glacially. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gave women some control over their earnings. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1878 allowed magistrates to grant separation orders. Small victories, each paid for in women's blood. By 1890, a working-class woman could theoretically divorce an abusive husband for under £100. Still impossible for most, but no longer unimaginable. The price of freedom was dropping, but for women like Margaret, it would always be too high. All these horrors built to one woman's breaking point, and Caroline Norton was about to receive the telegram that would shatter her forever. The telegram arrived on a grey September morning in 1842. "Come at once, William dying." Caroline Norton had been fighting for 2 years to see her children. 2 years of legal battles, public campaigns, and private anguish. She'd written pamphlets exposing the cruelty of custody laws. She'd lobbied members of Parliament. She'd become the public face of mothers' rights, all while privately dying inside from separation from her sons. Now, as her carriage raced through London streets, she prayed she wouldn't be too late. But George had timed his permission perfectly. He knew exactly how long his son had left. The servants' entrance. That's where they led her, like a tradesperson rather than a mother. Up the back stairs to a small room where 9-year-old William lay dying of lockjaw, his small body rigid with infection, his jaw clenched in the disease's characteristic rictus. 2 years. That's how long it had been since she'd held him. He'd been 7 then, gap-toothed and giggling, proud of learning to write his name. Now he was skeletal, aged beyond his years by illness and absence. When she took his hand, his eyes, clouded with fever, showed no recognition. "William," she whispered. "It's Mama." Nothing. No flicker of awareness. The law had stolen not just their time together, but their very connection. She was a stranger to her dying child, permitted to watch him leave a world she'd brought him into but been legally barred from sharing. The doctor, kindly but helpless, explained that William had been ill for weeks. The tetanus infection had spread despite treatment. If she'd been there earlier, could she have noticed symptoms sooner? Insisted on better care. The questions tortured her, but they were meaningless. The law had decided she had no right to protect her own child. She held him as his breathing grew shallower, sang the lullabies she'd once used to soothe his nightmares, hoping somewhere deep inside he might remember, stroked his hair, memorizing every feature of a face she'd been forbidden to see change from child to this. The end came quietly. One moment he was breathing. The next, he wasn't. No final words. No moment of recognition. Just the terrible silence of a child dying effectively motherless while his mother sat right beside him. George arrived after it was over. He'd been at his club, the footman said. He looked at his son's body with mild inconvenience, as if William's death had disrupted his schedule. To him, this was the loss of property, not a child. The law agreed with his interpretation. Caroline wasn't allowed to stay for the funeral. That was a father's prerogative, and George exercised it with cruel precision. She watched from a hired carriage as they buried her youngest son, legally forbidden from throwing earth on his coffin or leaving flowers on his grave. This wasn't just cruelty, it was law. British law, in 1842, gave fathers absolute power and mothers no rights whatsoever. William's death was just one casualty in a system that treated women as legal non-entities, their children as property they could create but never claim. Caroline channeled her grief into fury. Her pamphlet, The Separation of Mother and Child, by the Law of Custody of Infants Considered, became a rallying cry. She wrote with the passion of a mother who'd lost everything. The law gives a father the power to be unjust, and he uses it. He uses it because he can. Her campaign contributed to the Custody of Infants Act 1839, which gave mothers limited access to children under 7. A tiny victory, too late for William, but perhaps not for other mothers facing the same legal torture. The broader fight continued for decades. The Married Women's Property Acts, the Matrimonial Causes Acts. Each reform came drenched in women's tears and paid for in children's lives. The legal system that had killed William Norton with indifference gradually, grudgingly, began to recognize women as human beings rather than property. But Caroline never recovered from that grey September morning. She wore mourning for the rest of her life, not just for William, but for all the stolen moments, the missing years, the relationship the law had murdered as surely as disease had claimed his body. Her words echo through history. I exist in law only as another man's property. The children I bore in pain and raised in love belong to him absolutely. The law has made me a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of what should have been mine. The ghosts of Victorian marriage law, Caroline Norton holding her dying son, Ellen Woodhouse watching her business destroyed, Sarah Richards crawling through mineshafts while pregnant, all those women buried alive in asylums or beaten to death legally demand remembrance. Not as victims, but as warnings. The wedding night horrors weren't in the bedroom. They were in the law books, written by men who believed women's existence should end at marriage. Some of those beliefs died harder than William Norton. Some haven't died at all. Francis Wright, the Scottish reformer, said it best. I would rather be a free spinster and paddle my own canoe than be the slave wife of any man on earth. The price of that slavery was measured in women's bodies, minds, and lives. Never forget. Never go back. Never let law become a weapon against half of humanity again. The church bells that rang for Victorian weddings were also funeral bells. They tolled for the legal death of women who deserved to live.